Welcome, everybody. Great to see you. Very excited to talk to the unbelievably talented Mr. Amor Towles, and excited to also go through talking. He's one of the rare writers who's very comfortable talking about his process, and it's fascinating, and also really tells you a lot about how hard great writers work to make these things happen. So I was a writer for 20 years, and then I had at 43 kind of what my wife calls a midlife crisis that wasn't toxic, and so just had an idea that became Audible, and so that's been 27 years. So it's been quite an edifying. Talk about some pride. It was when I started, there were only 3,000 audiobooks that were unabridged in existence when we went public in 1999. And I think Audible added 475,000 new titles in the last 4 or 5 years alone. There's 800,000. And I think the biggest pleasure for me, though, is that tens of millions of people around the world, when they say they read a book, actually listened. And it's not even a divide in their minds anymore. And that really almost transcended all the dreams I had at the beginning. So I had the pleasure of meeting Amor 4 years ago, and actually started on a hockey bench between shifts because the defenseman, I'm the left defenseman, Dave was married to the novelist Christine Baker Klein, and he said, Christina was talking to Amor Towles, and he has this story that is probably too long for magazines. And he really is interested in your, publishing more original, shorter works. And the idea of Audible was always to perform, write, and direct to this intimate aesthetic. So it really wasn't just repositioning books as scripts going back. So I was thrilled. Amor came out, and we had a fantastically heady meeting together. And as I remember talking about not just, Audible, but economics and, publishing, politics, stories, and origins of stories, and mentors, which we might kind of mention, today when we talk. And it was just great. And then I said to the many people at Audible, let's do this. And next thing I know, I'm listening to, and I hope a lot of you got to listen to this amazing rendition. And it came out without any text, so the only way you could get it. And I can assure you, in the same sense that a million different titles of Amor's great, 3 main books have all just gone through Audible to people just in English. That many more people heard this than would have read it in the New Yorker. Much as we love the New Yorker, but let's face it, it's like Playboy used to be in the old days. You love the articles. Like nobody really reads all the long fiction because life is just too short. But one of the advantages of Audible is you can actually listen when you're doing other things, which is kind of one of the, the keys to its success. But when I would argue that listening to this is one of those better than the book. Remember the old thing, movies better than the book, the rare event. Many times the Audible rendition, because of the way it's refracted through an artful performance. And when I heard John Lithgow just even begin, I suddenly pictured, if the, the New Yorker Eustace Tilley guy had come to life, and maybe Edith Wharton was the director, had perfectly pinned the elegance of his prose, the humor, and this unbelievable depiction of older wealth of a certain stripe. So let me just start by just asking, we didn't talk about, we got to hang out last night. When you're writing and even reading your own work, do you hear it? Do you hear it as you write?
First of all, everything he said is true. I should know that. I can confirm everything he said, that Don said. And I should add that it is a great luxury for writers today to see the success of Audible. And I'm not just saying that to compliment Don, but because it does allow what we write to reach a broader audience and people who, for a variety of reasons, found the written text difficult. People suffering from illnesses, people who are traveling all the time, whatever the various categories, people who have dyslexia, but people who just prefer to listen for a part of their day. A lot of the people who use Audible are reading books at the same time, or going back and forth. But it has become one of the great compliments for novelists. I love when I receive a note from a reader saying, I got to my office today and I stayed in the parking lot for 20 minutes, because I had to hear the end of the chapter. And I love that concept of, or people saying, I missed the stop on my subway because I was deep in listening and I couldn't, I didn't want to get off the train. So it is kind of a whole new universe, and it's a great new addition to the way that people are interacting with narrative. In answer to Don's question, I am a very, there's a very strong audio component to the way that I think about my work, or particularly the way I edit my work. So the writing process, you kind of almost is invisible in a way to how it sounds. But the deeper you get into editing it, it becomes almost entirely at a certain point how it sounds. Once you have the material in the right place and the sequence of words, you're starting to listen to what is the syncopation of it, what is the tempo of it, what is how does it sound to my ear, the way the idea is unfolding, or the rhythm of the language, and so in the final round of editing, very often I am swapping out words because it doesn't sound quite right to me, and I want it to sound right when the reader is sort of reading it to themselves. So in a way, listening to my own writing it becomes a very important part of sort of the final process of sort of understanding how the final editing should be. Now, this is a very different thing than what I'm talking about than listening to voice. And I'm going to take a quick sidestep into that, particularly because if you listen to the Didomenico, or if any of you had a chance to, you'll have a sense of this. When we're writing fiction, whether it's novel form or short story form, there's all different ways in which you construct a narrative. And if you are using the omniscient narrator, of a Henry James style or Tolstoyan style, that sort of master of the universe who's going to relay the story to you has a voice, in a way, of course, it's an applied voice, but it's a relatively neutral voice. And Tolstoy and James are pulling out personality and prejudice and humor and a variety of things in order to get to this moment where it is the delivery of the events to you and the thoughts, the sentiments, the lives of the characters in sort of this pure form. And we can recognize Tolstoy as different from James and vice versa, but that's kind of what that sort of master, perfect, omniscient narrator is like. It's very different when you shift into a story like the Didomenico, where it is really being told to you by a personality. Because then you really have to say, for this story, to get to write this story well, to understand the story, to understand what the story is as a writer, you have to understand the voice of the individual who's telling it. What his or her tone is, what their background is, what their sense of humor is, what their cynicisms are, what makes them sentimental, what their vocabulary is, what things they would reference as from literature, if at all, or from the world at large. All that is built into the choice of this individual telling the story. And that is very much powered ultimately by hearing that person. Whether it's the Count in A Gentleman in Moscow or Katie in My Rules of Civility, I have to hear who that person is. I can know everything that's going to happen in the narrative from beginning to end, but until I hear that person, I can't really begin the process of writing it and have a complete understanding of what the story is going to be, because so much of the telling of that story, and therefore its themes and its emotions and its ideas, will be affected by who that individual is. And so this is a big difference between sort of the Jamesian or Tolstoyan omniscient narrator and stepping into a story like a Didomenico, where a personality ultimately is driving the word choice sentence by sentence.
And makes your work so much more amenable to powerful performance, I think. Because,
well, that's true too.
Because you use even the George Eliot, more almost antique, dear reader, direct response, or in theater it would be called breaking the fourth wall. You break out, and your characters are so much in themselves and aligned, as you say. So you have when the Percy is introducing the little girl said her name, she's named for, God help us, Emma Goldman. And you know his humor by then, that, you know, he's had, well, it's no part of a relative named for Emma Goldman. And so, and it's so much, you know, so intimate that he's telling you in his voice, and you know exactly who it is. But
right.
it's always been, you know, now that we're advanced into huge numbers of multi-voice experience and stuff, without either a driving, highly personalized, omniscient narrator, it still can be confusing, the theatrical numbers of voices, and it, you know, it kind of hang the story off it. But it seems to me that your work, and it's to me, and in your 3 books, the narrators all take it in a way that actually elevates, you know, that sense of this driving personality telling you a story.
Yes.
I think it's a very evocative sense of your work. So tell me a bit about because I should know this, but about the casting. Were you involved with? Did you have Ed Herman and John Lithgow and the various patrician voices and pick Lithgow? How did it go?
The Audible team will reach out and say, you know, we're very excited about doing this, and we want to get a sense of what do you think? You know, is there anybody that immediately leaps to mind? Maybe we get them, but at least whether we could or we couldn't, that gives us some guidance of how you think the story might sound. And so we began talking about a couple of different people. I don't think that Lithgow was on the list in that first round. But then they sort of start coming back and say, what do you think about this person? What do you think about this person? And just to sort of give me a chance to weigh in. But when they came and said, how about Lithgow? It was immediately like, oh, that's a good one. You know, we should have all thought of that right at the beginning. You know, as a perfect person. And I was like, if you can get Lithgow, you know, absolutely. You know, I'll chip in. Come on. You know, I didn't chip in, but yeah. So you know, because he has that quality of. That Percy has of, you know, we can sense that Lithgow often plays the persona of someone who's almost overeducated, you know, and where he's become a little bit cynical, a little bit wry, a little superior in this wonderful way. And there's a great humor to the way he can do that. But he can also be very cutting if he chooses to be, and very concise in the way that he would cut down, you know, describe another person he's witnessing. You can hear all that in many of Lithgow's performances. And so I was like, oh yeah, that's the perfect guy, you know, for this process.
That's great. So I think now let's talk about the story, and it's, you know, how did it come to you? I mean, I'm sort of struck if you go through your books, so it's the 20s and then the 30s and then 50s actually, with the last book. And now this takes a contemporaneous experience, which I'm not sure I've seen from you. So it's, you know, it's at least within the last, you know, sense of, you know, financial shocks and other things are mentioned. So how did it come together? How did the idea come up?
I've been writing fiction since I was a kid, and I wrote fiction in high school and college and graduate school. And so for me, I'll have ideas for stories or novels that have struck me since youth. And usually it comes in the shape of a notion. Oh, you know, what if this? What if, you know, like in the case of, you know, if you've read A Gentleman in Moscow, the beginning point there was, you know, what would it be like to live in a hotel for a long period of time? You know, I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. That'd be an interesting idea for a story. And then you start to build from there. And so sometimes when a notion like that comes, you can feel that it's like, ooh, this is there's a lot of opportunity, of theme, of nuance, of layers, of personalities, of events within the scope of this notion. You know, in the case of A Gentleman in Moscow, that immediately was clear to me. But sometimes you're like, oh, this feels like, I love this idea, but it feels like it would be perfect if it was a little bit more confined. You know, if it was sort of a little bit, if we brought it in. And so then you start thinking about it as a short story instead. And in this case, what happened is the background is that my mother's family comes from sort of old WASP New England. And I grew up in the Boston area near my grandparents, my mother's parents. And my grandfather was a very, you know, old WASPy guy. And when I was, say, 8 or 9, he lived in the house that my grandmother and he had raised my mother and her sisters in the neighboring town. And it was a nice sort of beautiful old brick house, and there was a staircase that went up, half a flight, took a turn, took another turn, then up the other half a flight in sort of the grand old staircase style. And at the landing, where you have very high ceilings, there was on one side a portrait of his great-grandmother, and on the other side a portrait of his great-grandfather, sort of Bostonians that were these portraits that were painted in the 19th century at some point, by some prominent Boston portrait artist. And they stood at this landing in the center of the house. And when I was around, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, something like that, my grandfather was like, enough with this big house, this sort of great practical waspy ways. Like, I can't, every time I write the heating bill, it drives me crazy. It's a total waste of money, and this is crazy, we have no business being here, and this is where we had Christmas morning as kids and everything like that. So it's like, so he sold the house, and they move into a little 200-year-old house not far from where I lived, and they move in. And the house is because it's 200 years old, the ceilings, I think, were like 8 feet tall. My grandfather was 6 feet tall. And so he had a duct through some of the doorways. And the portraits, we said, what are going to happen to the portraits? He says, we're going to hang them in the dining room, which had wainscoting in the New England style, boards, sort of wainscoting up halfway up the wall. And we said, well, how are the portraits going to fit in the dining room? He said, oh, I cut them in half. No problem. Reframed the heads, from the waist up, And it's like, well, we all terrible regret. None of us asked, where did the legs go? Because we all wished we owned the legs, the framed legs. But anyway, so the legs are gone. But so that's, and that was like, I was always so hilarious that my grandfather would do that. He was very unsentimental in that way. It was a practical solution, and so why would you cry? At any rate, so that happened in my youth. And I always kind of stuck with that. And at one point I had this, again, the notion comes up. And I had, wouldn't it be interesting if, instead of sort of that, what if you actually had a painting that was being handed down through this waspy family, and it was being cut not once, but like continued to be cut, generation to generation. And so that was kind of the notion that I started with. And when you have a notion like that, as I say, then you're like, well, is that a novel? And I'm like, well, no, maybe that feels like it'd be like a great story, sort of in this sort of intimate way to sort of see this. And then the doors start to open. You start to imagine, okay, well, wait, where and when is this set, and what actually is going to happen, and what's the painting, and who's telling the story? Is this the grandchild? Is it? And so pretty quickly in imagining these events, I was like, I can imagine that maybe it's maybe what's going to happen is that the parts have been scattered over the generations, and someone's going to go and try to reassemble the painting. That's nice. Maybe that'll be the idea. And so maybe actually the teller of the story is an older guy who's lost most of his money, but he's still sophisticated, and he's going to end up being approached, and he's going to try to sort of to make money by getting the buyer the last piece of the painting, et cetera. So you start to imagine these elements. And I'll take a quick side here on this, which is that then the question is, well, what's the painting? And what had happened in this case is that when I was on my honeymoon, my wife and I went to Italy, and we were in Tuscany, and so we had been to the Uffizi and Florence, and we had been going across the Tuscan countryside, seeing Fra Angelicas and different things. And on that journey, when I was, maybe I was 30 years old, basically, I had noticed that several Annunciations I had seen had the same format. And that kind of intrigued me, and I kind of was aware of the fact, well, the other religious paintings that you see out of the High Renaissance did not always have the same format, but the Annunciation seemed to. And then, the more I started looking for them as we traveled through Italy, and then it became clear that almost all of the major Renaissance painters had painted an Annunciation and in the same format. And I was like, that's really odd, and so I became convinced without any research that that the various painters of that era had turned the Annunciation following the kind of the same compositional rules, putting the Virgin on the right, seated, and the Archangel on the left, kneeling, and she has a book, and he has a flower, and there's a landscape in the distance, and an interior behind her, and you could see it again and again, and I was like, I think that they must have adopted that as kind of almost like a game, is to say, okay, I'm going to paint it in the same way that you did and that our predecessors did, and I'm going to take my version of it, and it's sort of to show what they could do. And sort of a little bit of competition. And the fact that you had these different elements, the landscape and interior, the flower, the book, the two portraits, meant that you were kind of being forced to show your mastery of the various different elements of painting at the time. A landscape, a still life, a portrait, were all kind of built into this, an interior and exterior. Anyway, so that kind of became my notion, and I thought, I'll write an essay about that at some point, or I'll write a little short book about it, or I don't know. And I started collecting images of Annunciations, and I did that for 20 years, and I kept stashing it away, and I had this folder of all this stuff. And of course, so there I am, sitting here, designing the Didomenico story. And I know I've got this guy who's this ex-Sotheby person. I know there's a painting that's been cut up. I know
yeah. I took art history from Horst Janssen, the big history of art.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We love that.
And I totally bought into this. Of course, this minor Renaissance guy, Didomenico, must have gone with Fra Lippo. He totally sold me on it. And then last night I found out it was made up.
Yeah, it is
so
made
talk about the verisimilitude capacities of a great writer.
Didomenico is an invention. So you can see how these things come together. So you take my grandfather cutting his portrait, and then the idea, and then needing a picture in the middle, and then I was like, oh, this is great. It'll be the Annunciation, and then I can drag in all this other stuff, which somehow also resonates with the story overall. And so that's like, the way that kind of these things play out.
That's great. But the richness of the secondary stories and the characters also make the story as powerful as it is. So did the little boy, the TSL, the sense of, so was your reaction to the carving up of the paintings perhaps reflected in his sensitivities and interest in art? Yeah,
you mean in terms of the boy?
Yeah.
Lucas?
Lucas, yeah.
I really like, at a certain point I was like, okay, this is going to be great. He's going to go and he's going to know they're going to be hunting, somebody rich is going to be hunting for the pieces. He's going to know that there's one piece. It's going to be a nephew or, a cousin who's younger in Brooklyn, and that's where the action going to take place. And I was like, yeah, and that's great. That cousin will be like a Brooklynite, will be sort of a liberal feminist, and he'll roll his eyes about it all, and the uncle will kind of go. And probably one of my favorite moments in the story is when Percy arrives and rings the bell, having kind of talked his way into an invitation for dinner, and Lucas opens the door, who he hasn't seen, maybe ever, or certainly not since he was a baby, and Lucas is 10 or 11. And the reason I like this moment is because when you're like, oh yeah, this is going to be an interesting story, this idea of the painting cut up, part of the reason you say, okay, this is an interesting story, is your sense as a writer that it comes with these various elements of thematic sort of material built into it that you can investigate as the writer, that the reader can consider as they read. And so meaning that, like, on the one hand, you've got this notion of the history of painting, going from the Renaissance to the contemporary, and how we value and think about paintings. And here is a guy from Sotheby's, and we're going to end up talking about Van Gogh auctions. So you've got you've got that sort of thread. You've got sort of this old wasp, who's sort of this, coming from this sort of a great tradition of wealth and whatever, and politesse that has come to its sort of last steps. And that's sort of going to be built into it. But then you've got this sort of component of family. And Percy is this moment where, having had this very rich family history, it's almost run its course. He is not married. He has not had children. His cousin Billy, he kind of looks a little down on a little bit, and he's sort of a different kind of guy, and he kind of makes fun of him. The old family house has been sold where they would gather, and so the family's almost run its course for him, and it's partly because for Percy, a lot of the family is no longer really resonates with him. He like Billy. They don't see eye to eye really, and so what the hell? And he has Thanksgiving alone and takes pride in that. That he has Thanksgiving at a Chinese restaurant because, good Lord, I love that his description of the Thanksgiving meal where
his riff on Thanksgiving.
Yeah, everybody's cooking and nobody should be, and the food is it's either overcooked
There's no
or
such
undercooked.
thing as a good turkey.
Yeah, and he says, so I go and have dinner, lunch by myself, and so, but that's where he is, and so at this moment when the door opens and Lucas is there, and what ends up happening, I'm paraphrasing, is he says, I knock on the door, and he said, Lord, he thinks for a second he's in the wrong place, because it looks like, there's this sort of version of T.S. Eliot has opened the door, a childhood version of T.S. Eliot, and he says, oh, Uncle Percy, and, come on in, and the boy says, I like your vest, to Uncle Percy. Percy says, well, I like yours, and he says, it's a Harris tweed, the boy says, and he says, I know, I can tell. And what I love about this is, this can happen in families, right, which is that you can kind of think, if you're Percy, I am the last member of this family, which is descended down the generations, that has any of these sensibilities. And my siblings didn't, my first cousins didn't, and whatever. And here, and certainly my nephew doesn't, the guy who's teaching in Brooklyn and who's married to a feminist, and he met her in women's studies class, good Lord, and they got married outside with a mandolin, he's like, clearly I'm not that guy. And
changed his name.
And then suddenly, changes his name to hers, and he opens the door, and it turns out that their kid is him, because that can happen in this weird way, partly through genetics, partly through chance, partly through the way the world works, and it's just sort of this eye-opening moment, and I love that's why I say that's my favorite moment, because all of it falls from that, which is his connection to Lucas, and Lucas's connection to him, and his re-entry into the family that he's almost abandoned, and becomes about through that surprise connection in this unpredictable way with the 10-year-old boy.
Yeah, you really.
I'm selling you my story. I know.
You focus so often on, if not the tired and end of the line aristocrat, or or the old money gone to less, and the loss of it. It's often in there, and even there was royalty and even in Lincoln Highway, there were aristocrats in there from various, and it seems like, and clearly you come by this kind of naturally and stuff. I mean, you don't just introduce Billy. You say no one is born pompous. Which he sort of said. There's a pause, a Lithgow, like let's. It was just fantastic. But clearly there's something about that old Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of world that you take in. I mean, do you feel like you veer in that direction because of your own experience of it?
Well, that's where I come from. I try not. Some writers try to really dig into the world they come from and mine it deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And there's a lot of great writers who do that. Raymond Carver's short stories are not entirely, but are largely related to his personal experience as a struggling working man who's struggling with alcoholism and difficult marriages and loss of money and squeaking by day to day, and that comes across in a lot of his work. And Updike mined himself, and Chekhov does, and I've just always been sort of more interested in using fiction to go and explore other things. So then every now and then I kind of circle back, or it comes through in a thread, and I can feel like something I've witnessed in my childhood very closely beginning to express itself. And so that was definitely a pleasure in a Didomenico story where we're like, okay, we're going all in to the New England WASP world that I did witness firsthand, and building out from that.
So there's a moment of reality in there where you drop the name of the Australian collector Alan Bond, and a forgotten but fairly famous at the time, the beginning of the kind of ballooning of the art scam world and the financial structures and all the world of art that's become unbelievably part of the asset porn world that we live in now. So But that's real. So
Yes.
tell a story of the lilies, because that's I think interesting the way you insert something overtly real with all the economics
Yes.
behind it into this fantastical story.
And again, just sort of very interesting little the minutia of way things pop up. My mentor when I was in college was a writer named Peter Matheson, and when I graduated, who was visiting for a semester at Yale, and I got to know him, and he was the first person who really said, I think you're gifted at this, and I think you might be gifted at it, and I hope you'll take your work as seriously as I'm going to take your work, and that was a big turning point in my life. But anyway, so Peter and I would see each other in the years after I was at graduate school in New York, and we spent time together. And one night we had dinner out in Sagaponack, and one of the guests at the table at this small dinner was a guy named Robert Hughes, who was the art critic for Time magazine and a very revered art critic at the time. And this is in the 80s. And we were talking about things that had just happened, and this was all very contemporary. And Robert Hughes told this extraordinary story. He said, this craziest effing thing is going on, which is that Sotheby's and Christie's have begun loaning money or arranging for loaning money to their customers, using the paintings they're buying as the collateral for the loan. So it was this crazy idea that you could bid more and more, which made the painting more and more valuable, which meant you could borrow more and more money to buy. It was just nuts, And he said this example was the most expensive painting ever bought. It had just happened, which was Alan Bond buying Van Gogh's Lilies. And he then went on to say, what ended up happening behind the scenes is that when Bond bought it, sort of borrowed money on the basis of the painting, and it was an international news story, he was going to recoup money by touring the painting in Australia with his collection. And the attorneys of the lenders stepped in and said, you cannot take the painting to Australia because we will never be able to reclaim it should you go into bankruptcy. And there was an impasse. And Sotheby's entered in and said, tell you what, we'll arrange to have the painting copied. We're gonna paint a forgery. We're gonna make a forgery. And you could take the forgery to Australia and pretend it's the real thing and tour it around Australia and for ticket prices and make the money back. And meanwhile, the original will stay in a bank in New York City so it's safe for the creditors. And I was like, that's the craziest story. And you stow that away. So I stowed that away, not knowing what to do with that story that I had heard from Robert Hughes. And then so I'm in writing this story, and Percy is at the Met, and he's at the Met with Lucas. He's trying to show Lucas the importance of collectors and of people giving art to museums and restoring art, because he's trying to kind of convince his nephew to sell the painting. That's part of his plan. And then this story gets told. And so again, it sort of pops up in it, and so every now and then, the reality in the world you drag into the world of fiction because they resonate.
So we're going to turn it for questions in a few minutes, but I just want to ask a question here. So, how many people here, won't offend him, know that this guy was a banker for 20 years? Does everybody know that? Okay.
Money management.
Right.
Yeah,
So we talk about this because my mentor, we talked about our mentors too, was Ralph Ellison. So he was my transformative teacher, and the reason I was a writer and the reason Audible exists is all because of what I learned from one brilliant, great American novelist and intellectual. So we talk about this. I did 20 years as a writer and then a businessman. We sort of switched it around, but it is I get the sense that Matheson didn't necessily approve of you selling out to capitalism.
That's true. No, that's true. Anyway, what actually happened is that when I began, I joined a friend of mine to work in the investment business. A friend had started a firm. I was his first colleague, and then was his partner for 20 years. Well, when I started in that field, I would see Peter. We'd have dinner every year or so, or twice a year, and he'd say, "So, are you still working at that investment thing?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm doing. How's your book coming?" "Well, it's not coming so well." And he was really mad, and because we had spent a lot of time together, and he had read a lot of my work, and he had been very supportive of my talent, and so or at least my aspirations. And so he felt deservedly let down. And finally, after a couple of years, we had dinner one night, and it was just the two of us. And at the end of dinner, he said, Amor, and he at this point, let's say he's in his late 60s probably. He said, in my life, I have seen multiple generations of artists, including from when I was 20 myself. And I've known multiple generations of artists, and I've seen artists go to Wall Street. Painters, actors, writers. And what I can tell you, after seeing this from generation after generation, is that that industry is interesting enough, entertaining enough, dynamic enough, pays you enough, that when they go and leave their art to go work it, I'm telling you, they never come back. And so I think that you should assume that your life as a writer is over. That was the end. That was the end of that. Well, that was the end of dinner, and so that really haunted me. And so I did not write for a number of years. Really after that, I mean, I wasn't writing really very actively at the time. I did not write for a number of years after that because we were so busy building the firm. But it kind of, I think of it as that's my version of Jacob Marley with his chains. I mean, it's Peter was going to be there, rattling the chains. He was still alive, but to say, where are you? Where's your book? I'd be hearing that for the rest of my life. And so eventually I did get back and then wrote a book I didn't like and set aside. Then I wrote Rules of Civility, and when that became a bestseller, I retired. And I thank God that Peter was alive at that time. So when Rules of Civility hit the bestseller list, we had lunch like a week later, and it would have been so disappointing to me if I had failed to do that in his lifetime.
Yeah. Is there a quick answer to this? Oh. This is a short story, or short story novella. It's in the realm.
Long short story.
Why did it end up short? Why, when you have all these things on the drawing board, why wasn't this worthy of a full novel? And not that it's pejorative, but clearly you felt this was worthy of ending as a short story.
Something about sort of just keeping it about the painting and the history of the painting and the search for the pieces and at the end having all the pieces sort of gathered together, I felt like that's great. And where if you turn that into the novel, it would be like an element of a novel, or it would be like you have to build 1,000 things around it, and it just felt like real nice. And I should point out that when I'm writing short stories, it's usually because I'm in between novels. Let's say I finish General Moscow and I'm on the road, speaking about a General Moscow for half a year, something like that if you're lucky, and I don't start a new novel during that time because I can't do it. So I'll write short work during that time, and so you're almost kind of excited to have an idea that feels smaller because you're like, oh yeah, that's great. I'll be able to write that in the course of September and October while I'm on the road, and then I can shift gears later.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we're going to turn it up for questions in 1 second, but so I just want to say, I want to say thanks because I do want you to come back and write one to the forum, because it is, at this point, most of the literary writers are trying to come and basically saying, I want to write this for the Audible aesthetic. So if you want to check out some, Jodi Picoult just had a new one, Britt Bennett, Imani Perry, James Patterson, believe it or not, goes right into the format, and Ishmael Reed and others. So it's really, the dream of this was always that you had a very particular aesthetic and that it's weirdly intimate. It's not a point to many. It's nothing like radio. And almost everybody hears being read to in some primal way that probably harks back to a happy childhood. And it's also, frankly, how we got American literature, and this is another discussion, but there is no question that our oral and vernacular culture is why Stephen Crane and Mark Twain wrote like Americans when Henry James was still writing like a Brit. So we have a very, there's a lot of intellectual integrity to this conception, even though when I started Audible, abandoning my writing career and abandoning text itself, as the gossip column said, it was quite a stir that I was, abandoning text as its primacy, but that's another discussion.
And Don is right about the length thing,
Yeah.
is that the major journals that publish short stories would prefer that a short story be a few thousand words, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. For whatever reason, I get interested in stories that are 15,000 words, 20,000 words, and where more can happen, more development can occur, and it's basically unprintable, around the country. And so the great thing about the Audible team, and again, I'm not trying to sell Audible to you either, but is that they're like, that's what we would prefer, right? Because as a listener, a 3,000 word listening experience is too short. You want it to be something where it's 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever the dynamic is. And so there's a lot of it is this sort of a perfect medium for that story that is longer. That's the perfect home.
Look, parents go in touch with Audible for the last 20 years. It's been always that they see their kids involved of a very much longer arc experience of concentration, listening to a story, than they ever get from the more fast twitch world of the way reactive interactions are for kids. And and people from the beginning were always going back to the Russian masters because you can listen. And first of all, it's not 4 pounds in your hands, but it's you can listen and the names just go right past it. I thought of it with Gentleman in Moscow too. There is something about not having to stop on a 6-syllable term or name. There are a lot of the unintended consequences to the whole thing. But I stopped writing in part because my 15,000 word, 12,000 word articles in magazines that were in the golden age just kept going down. And then it was 75, then it was 5,000, and Tina Brown of Vanity Fair actually made everything 5. So then it kept going. Yeah. And so that was sort of one of the reasons that I was freed up. All right, so let's have some questions. Yes, please, Ronnie.
Well, she raised her hand
right.
first
Okay,
in the
sorry.
very back row. I feel like we should give her the
Jennifer.
credit for that.
Sorry, Jennifer.
Thank you. So I feel like I've flown into like a landscape painting here in Aspen. It's my first time here. But I flew in from New York. So I know 2-3 bankers who are a bit like you where, I think they're writers at heart, but haven't quite made that leap. And so I'm going to share your story with them when I go back. But my question is, you said you eventually got back into writing. And so I'm now deeply curious, like what that spark was that got you back into it.
Well, it was dread. I mean, like I was saying earlier. I mean, you'd think it would be the love of it, because I really love it more than anything in my life, other than my wife and kids. I love writing more than anything else, and you would think that would be enough. And but as it turned out, when you get distracted by life and by your career and by whatever, that you can start to push it to the side. And when you do that with the arts, art is a habit. It becomes intimidating if you're on the outside of it. And so you have to kind of be in it and doing it in order for it to be sort of an easy, it becomes easier if it's a habit. And so otherwise you have to claw your way back into it. And so as I say, you'd think that it would have been the love of it is what brought me back to it, but it really was the dread. It was the dread of waking up one day and having failed to do it again. And then that forced me to sort of start the process all over again. And then once I got deep into it again, then I've never turned back. But yeah. All right, so Rodney.
First, loved you on Jeopardy.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Thank you. I was not a contestant for anybody, by the way, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You have arrived at your destination.
Yeah.
That was a short one also.
Yes.
Loved it. A couple of comments. One, I love listening to Audible. I listen to it in the car. I listen to it working out. I listen to it falling asleep. I set it for 30 minutes, then I have to go back for the 15 I missed.
Yeah, right.
But
You can shake the phone and it automatically adds 5 to 10.
It's kind of confusing, actually. But when I read Lincoln Highway and Rules of Civility, there's you have such a spectacular way with words. Kind of reminds me a little bit. Is it Thomas Wolfe, Man in Full? Also, words you want to remember, descriptions that you pick up, and I go, no offense, I can't do that in Audible because I can't underline it. I can't go back to it and say, oh, I want to remember that he said it that way.
Yeah.
And those ways are just so spectacular. So now the real question is, you did this on Audible. You can't publish a book that's this big. How do the economics of that work? Because I'm paying, not in this case, it was free in this one.
Yeah.
But normally I buy an Audible book, it's $15 or something like that. But yours is half a book.
We're getting into this. Audible is a very generous employer. So a lot of the proprietary work that you could only hear on Audible, at least for a period of time, let's say, they are commissioning that. So they are stepping in and saying, we will pay you X if you're willing to share that story with us on an exclusive basis for a period of time. And in this group of stories, very often it's, if not always, we're going to make that free to our, our Amazon Prime clients or whatever, the most loyal customers. And so it's a very generous circumstance for the authors in that case.
And
I will say that and Don knows this, that story will ultimately be in print. And that was another thing that was very generous of Audible. They said, listen, we will pay you to have that story, to share it with our listeners for a period of time. And I said, I would like it to be available to be in a collection in the future. And they said, you know what, that's fine too. Which is, many people in that situation would say, no, if we're going to pay for it, we don't want it to appear in another form, But Don was like, no, that's totally fine. And so that I will have a collection of short stories that comes out in April.
in print.
In print, and which will be 6 short stories, long short stories that take place in New York, and 1 novella which takes place in Los Angeles, and the Didomenico will be one of the stories in that collection.
And you have arrived at your destination?
Will not be.
It was very good. I was wondering whose voice that's going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Here you go.
You wanna-
Sure.
My question, going back to your professor at Yale and your experience, where are you in looking at the next generation of writers, or what is your involvement or not?
Oh man, I am not involved. And that's partly because, but I think about it a lot for the reasons you're implying. It is principally because I didn't get my first novel published until I was 45. And so I sort of feel like I'm behind. And I have a lot of friends. I've had one of the luxuries of becoming an author and with a following, and is that you start to know your peers. I'm good friends with Jeffrey Eugenides and with Gary Steingart and Michael Cunningham wrote The Hours, and they all teach. And because if you decided at the age of 25 you're going to write fiction as your career, you could not make a living doing so, even at their level. With Eugenides and Michael Cunningham have both won either the National Book Award or the Pulitzer Prize, and you could not have survived as an author on a standalone basis. So they do teach, and that's been a part of their career now for 30 years. So for me, coming out at 45 with my first novel, but at this point they have written 6 novels, 7 novels, Colson White has written 8 novels, whatever it is. I'm like, so as much as I believe that I owe in Peter's honor, I need to make myself available to the next generation. I've got to get I don't know what the number is, 5 books done before that happens. Peter was, as I say, was in his 60s when he came and taught at Yale, and so I figure I got I'm 58. Maybe I've got 7 years before that bill comes due, but that bill will come due.
Look, the problem is that literary writing stopped selling. It just did, and the generation that appreciated it was starting to age out. It's a business problem. The reason these people all work in the university is because the university, unlike the publishing industry, is the place that perpetuates highly literary writers. There are always going to be genius, smart writers. It just happens. It's a certain way you see the world, hear the world, experience the world, what you feel compelled to do, and how you read. I'm pretty proud that Audible's come in on a business level and tried to support this, in a big way. But it's a lot. If you asked any publisher, short stories don't sell. You need to have 3 bestsellers before anybody's going to even touch a book of short stories. It's just it's a very publishing is a pretty tortured business model. So in some ways, I don't think it's a question of teaching. In fact, most of the writers I know didn't necessarily, who are really successful, didn't come up through training and going to these events and stuff, because there's pleasures to writing, which is not because you sell, it's because you love doing it. But it's a complicated question, but I lived it for a long time, 2 careers.
I guess so. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is not a question, it's just a comment that struck me as the 2 of you were talking. I was widowed a few years ago, and one of my 6 sons, who happens to be in the financial business, one of the things he said to me shortly after that time, he says, "Mom, you're going to be okay. You've got a rich inner life." And the rich inner life, which he shares with me, is based on reading and writing. And I like the 4-pound books. You know, I'm still there, a certain age. And so I have to tell you, this was my first Audible experience.
Yeah.
And I experienced it before I fell asleep. And damned, what happened? Within a couple of days, I don't know how this happened, I was reading Raymond Carver and John Updike.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
Yeah, how does that happen?
Yeah.
And then within whatever the next time was that I happened to go to church, I look up at my stained glass windows in my church, and I said, "Oh my God, there it is, the Annunciation." And there's what I was just hearing about. So thank you for that. Lord
welcome.
knows how these things happen, but interesting experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pass it right behind you, because I think the two people behind you had a question.
Thank you. I feel like I'm hearing from you all that my generation is letting everyone down on demand for good books. I'm curious about, I think to me, a kind of core brilliance in your writing is how rich your characters are and how the commentary through their voices draws on these characters' whole lives worth of observations and life experiences. And I don't see that in a lot of places, and it makes your book so wonderful. Someone yesterday I was telling I was coming here described your writing as delicious, and I think that is the exact right word for it in terms of these lines that that stick with you. And I'm wondering if that is the way you happen to observe the world and speak in your life, or what are your models for creating characters like that?
All right, so I'd say two things about that. The first is that having written fiction since I was a kid, I really became what I wanted to do when I was in first grade. And so you do start to build into your mental process, probably you're processing the world in a slightly different way. In whatever our passions are, that starts to affect how we process the world. And so maybe you listen a little differently, you think about a conversation a little differently, because it's a part of sort of the writerly mind, let's say. So that's a factor. I think for the bigger thing, though, is we were talking about this about last night a little bit. Every writer I know approaches the craft very differently at every step of the process. And writers who are enormously successful from a literary standpoint or a financial standpoint, whatever, they approach it differently. And so one of the aspects of the way I approach things is that when I have a notion that I'm interested in, let's say in the Lincoln Highway, two guys, somebody's driving home from prison at the age of 18 or from a juvenile prison, and he's about to start his life anew, and it turns out 2 kids from the prisoner in the trunk of the warden's car. That's where I started, which is the opening, in essence, of that book. And when I have something like that grabs me, I can start to see it. Okay, yeah, this has got a lot of things that are going to happen in this story. Is I do a design phase. And for me, the design phase is I will spend somewhere between 2 and 7 years just thinking about it, and I'm not writing it, and I'm writing something else at the time, or other things. But over the course of that 5 years, whatever it is, I just every now and then, while I'm have free time, I'll turn my attention back to it, and be like, okay, so what happens to that kid? Who's in the trunk? Where are they going to? And what happens next? What happens when they head toward New York? What happens in New York? And whatever. I just keep imagining it. Now, so a part of that process is who are these people? And that means understanding their backgrounds and their personalities and how that would influence their decisions that they're making on the road as they do these different things. And so I think that, and I appreciate what you said about the richness of the work, and for me, there's no question about it that one reason, if my work has reached a certain level of richness, is partly because of that, which is that long before I start to write chapter 1, I have gotten deeper and deeper and deeper into the reality of the world that I'm about to describe, the people, their emotional states, their ideas, their psychological interactions, so that when I'm writing it, there's a lot of electricity kind of pumping through the process. Now, and then right before I start, once I say, okay, I am going to do this, I've filled various notebooks with a lot of writing about the thing. I know it from beginning to end. I'll then outline it in great detail, chapter by chapter, everything that happens. And then I'll go about the process of beginning to write the book. And I'll I'll share this. One of the counterintuitive aspects of that process is that when I outline, I'm an obsessive outliner, the reason I outline, which is a very, outline is a very left-brainy kind of thing. Right brain is the creative, imaginative, subconscious side of the brain. The left brain is the more analytical side and with more precision, et cetera. The reason I do all the outlining is because I want, when I'm actually writing the chapters, to free up the right side of my brain to a maximum degree. I want the poetic instinct to take over, the dream instinct, so that the images, the word choice, the ideas, the sentiments are coming out of sort of a deeply poetic space. And in order to that, or what flow in the modern sense is the term that can be used in the creative effort, to achieve that, it's advantageous to me to have outlined the thing in great detail so that that side of my mind doesn't have to run the process. Whereas if I enter a chapter and I don't know what's going to happen or what characters or where they're from, the other side of the brain is solving problems. You know, what's happened? What's the room look like? The character comes in, who's the character? And you're getting bogged down in all of that and not in sort of this creative, imaginative invention, which again, I think is important to taking this thing I've thought about very carefully and then bringing it actually to life in a sense of, breathing the spirit of life into it. But last thing I'll say about that is in editing, very often you sharpen, the editing is very helpful in bringing the things to life because it's by taking things out. Like, to make something really feel like the heart's beating and that you're reading along with the individual as they're experiencing things, is generally that is improved by taking out excess words, excess descriptions, excess events, and getting it down to where it's really, it's most streamlined fashion. So again, that's a little counterintuitive. Like, is by taking words away that you're actually getting the life back into the material that you imagined. So it's sort of this multi-layered process.
Thank you so much. Have a couple of comments, but also a question. But I found myself thinking about what I always felt like was a seminal short story, which was The Gift of the Magi. Because the way that you came to this sort of ending that was totally unexpected, that may have been sort of a disaster for your character, and yet as he was sitting at the head of the Thanksgiving table, you could imagine what a wonderful ending. So really, it was as good as your novels that you've written, that I have read. But I really had a question for you, Don, because 25 years ago, ExxonMobil moved to Dallas, and they brought what I called some of the trailing spouses, a woman named Kay Catarula, who brought to Dallas Arts and Letters Live, which has been a huge success. It was really based on Isaiah Sheffer and doing Symphony Space and the whole idea of listening to short stories. And so they bring these great actors to present short stories on the stage. And I always, as a reader, and I was very visual, I was an art history major, which is another reason I loved your story. But basically, I always felt like it was a little bit of a practice that I had to be more auditory, where I really had to sit and concentrate, and you really have to think and not let yourself be distracted. And there's been some of the lectures that I've been to here where they've talked about, they had a woman from Calm that was talking about meditating and being present. So I just wondered if you knew about that particular method and if that was something that was influencing you. Do you live in New York? Is that?
Yeah, New York.
Because I don't, but anyway, I didn't know whether that was the kind of,
there's-
if that's a tradition in the city where that's being done.
Right.
In Dallas, it's very unique, but it's been very successful.
Yeah, there's many, many examples of people using the oral rendition of ideas and literature. One of the first things Audible had to do, which we did through science, debunk the idea that retaining even information is better in text. It's actually 50-50. People are just built, it's basically 50-50. And some people are going to be more auditory learners and not. The idea of, we did a lot of scientific stuff because, the Greeks were absolutely against anything but oral literature or oral expression. And they had a system called mnemonics, which was a memory-based system. And text was rejected through St. Augustine by all those thousands of years because it would atrophy the creativity and memory. So the textual revolution really started with, as it always does with technology, which was the automation of text. And the 19th century was clearly the apogee of reading text, and then it's been a powerful thing ever since. So yeah, it's being read to, obviously, we know that that's part of childhood and stuff. There's a lot of evidence that when kids hit chapter books versus picture books, and they're not being read to anymore, that's when reading outcomes do tend to fall off. So the kind of the power of listening is in lots of different ways, but yeah, people performing. What's also interesting is that authors reading, going back to Audible, I think we still have it, it's a rights issue, but we actually had Walt Whitman reading with Thomas Edison as the sound man. And you can actually, but you can go through and various, Faulkner, my kind of god for my, literary aspirations, was not a good reader of his own work. Norman Mailer, unbelievable. So it's interesting. Well, Styron, actually, what you were saying about we were sort of hearing, he read to everybody. Because he didn't feel comfortable submitting a manuscript until so many people had heard him read it, and then he'd change it based on how he's listening to himself. So there's always been this amazing interplay between vernacular oral renditions and literacy and literature. It's fascinating. It just ended up, for various reasons, that the dissemination of audio books was stuck in book publishing, which was against it. So there weren't any, and then we changed that.
It is funny. What you're talking about, obviously the Greek epics were all oral. Homer's work was oral, and so the Odyssey and the Iliad were oral stories first, and before someone eventually got around to setting them down. But you can see how a lot of the tools that were developed by the classic oral tradition that got adopted later by storytelling were because it was oral. So and this that comes up in the Lincoln Highway, for those of you who read it, but in medias res, this notion of starting the story in the middle, which has become a standard tool in all narrative, since the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, you can imagine as a storyteller, if you're going to tell the history of the Trojan War, and if you started 5 years before the war, and this happened, and so did this, and this happened, like you would start to lose your audience, And so eventually you realize, no, we're going to start in the middle of the war. Achilles is going to be in his tent. The war is already happening. You don't know how it's begun, and you don't know why he's angry, and you don't know why someone's come to speak to him, and suddenly that has an incredible engagement for the audience, right? And so that concept, which was really, I'm sure, came out of a sort of oral necessity, then gets adopted by the written narrativists for the next 1,000 years.
Speaking of Lincoln, in the last half of the 19th century, the culture heroes, there were dozens of them, who everyone knew about, were these people, all men, who could give these 2 and 3 hour speeches. And at Lincoln, at Gettysburg, he was the backup singer. He was literally, they went actually to hear one of these guys.
And he was panned, too.
Exactly.
Lincoln was panned.
Yeah. But the reason these people were able to have this international renown was the railroad. It was, again, technology. They could go from place to place fast enough to actually be paid, and be paid well, to give these speeches. But it was all people would come from far, with educations and not educations, just to listen.
That's right. Oh, we're saying here, last question. We're being signaled, but
Okay, what's that?
Does somebody else?
if somebody else, but you can go at the second time. Or did we skip you? We did, right?
Actually, I just have a brief question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Mirela from Aspen, Romania, so it's a pleasure to see you. My question was, we usually, maybe it seems a bit naive, but we usually think of writers of spending a lot of time writing, reading, reflecting upon wonderful ideas. I'm wondering what gives you the power and the energy besides the hours that you spend on this type of activity? Which other activities fulfill your daily schedule, so to say?
Oh yeah, I don't. Good Lord, I don't know. What are my hobbies and things? I do a lot of the cooking in my family, and so there's that. I have my daughter is 18, my son is 21. But so for the last 10 years, I had teenagers at all times. So that's very demanding, and a part of my life and my wife and my life. I don't paint or draw. I love music, all kinds. I listen to music all the time. I start the day with a bagel, a cup of coffee, and the crossword puzzle. So we all have our things, right? We all have our
Travel, you clearly.
Yeah, I do. My wife and I love to travel and see the world. We love, and I love visual narrative. We do live in this extraordinary moment of long form television, or whatever you want to call it, which has allowed visual storytelling really to break out of the rut it was in. I'm a great fan of the movies of the 30s and the 40s, and there were these incredible movies. But if you look at the last 20 years, movies were increasingly built around a formula that was taught and adhered to and produced to, and the 3-chapter or whatever they call it, movie and so. And we got to the point where you go to a movie and you're like, yeah, I kind of know what's happening, and it's going to be cliches, and they're going to say the same things, and the same action scene, and the same arc, and we got it very frustrating. Long-form television broke that open, where suddenly you can have these narratives that are 6-8 hours, and where characters are developed.
And they're actually good. It's funny you
really
say that,
good,
because we're talking about it's not a downfall of the book industry. It's just life changes. But in my lifetime, if I ever thought that this episodic television could have been that artistic, The Wire, Breaking Bad, this operatic structure. I grew up when television in the early 60s was so stupefying and stupid that the government stepped in, and that's why they created public broadcasting. They thought we were going to lose the war against the Russians because of television. So life definitely changes. But I've often said that, if I was a storyteller type that I was when I got out of college, now I probably would have wanted to go try to write a Breaking Bad or The Wire, or one of these unbelievably sophisticated stories in visuals. So, it changes. But I've sometimes give speeches to the Audible kind of nation of people who work all over the world. So they say, you've got to stop and say, we're really doing something right, because there's more choice to how to use your time with cultural activity now. You can lose yourself in a game for a week. You can do things often free that are unbelievably diverting from focusing on something like listening to an Audible title, and still people do. So it's interesting. That was a good question.
Oh, so you're saying we have another last question? Yes. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
So one, thank you very much. And it was actually my first experience to be able to experience any of your writing.
Okay, thanks.
When I listen to your tone and cadence and your voice, I actually hear you reading the book. And I don't know if I'm hearing a little bit of John Lithgow in you, or I'm hearing it the other way around. Yeah. But have you considered any of your short stories and doing them yourself? Why? What about that?
It hasn't really come up. My first novel, Rules of Civility, it's a first-person narrative about a 25-year-old woman. So it made no sense. Well, I could have done it. But it seemed great to have like a woman who was a professional actress do it, and so we did that. In the case of A Gentleman in Moscow, when they said, what do you want to do with this? I felt like it should be a Brit with Shakespearean training, because the nature of that story, it's a Russian aristocrat born in the 19th century who's very cultured. I felt like, to the American ear in particular, having that sort of British tone would help carry that sophistication. And I wanted the Shakespearean training because a lot of the language is quite dense in a positive way, I think, but it's not Hemingway. It's these long passages which the British Shakespeareans really have trained to sort of play out that cadence of language over and the music of language very carefully as they're giving the idea as well. So that's how we ended up there. With the Lincoln Highway, it's told from 8 perspectives, including a young woman, an African American veteran, a series of young 18-year-old boys, and it just felt like, yeah, that would be fun to have different people actually play those different parts, And so in each case, it seemed like it was a better idea to use somebody else. Nobody ever asked me for any of them. but I mean,
This last one, though, you could have very well.
I could have done the John Lithgow thing because I know that tone. You're right. I grew up around that tone. I went to an Ivy League school where you're exposed to that sort of particular kind of cadence as well. And so I think of all the things I've written, that would be an easy one to deliver in that way. But he's older than I am, which has helped out too. Not much older, but older. Well, thank you very much, everybody. We
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.